So this is Fujifilm's GFX 100 RF, and it is a camera that I desperately want to love, and I kind of do in some ways. I'm going to give you the good parts about it. I'm going to give you the bad parts about it. I'm going to give you the parts about it. And for Fuji shooters, the part will probably be the most interesting. It looks to me sort of like if the X100 series and a Leica got together and they had a baby. It is very Leica-esque. So in engineering and design, there's this idea of form follows function, which means that if you're designing something, it should look like the things that it can do. You're building a race car, you want that to have smooth edges that the air can flow over. You want maybe a spoiler on the back, you want a big engine inside of it. The function is race car, the form is what looks like a race car. But if you're building an SUV, you don't want it to look like a race car, right? You want it to look like a car with a hatchback on it that goes up and some space you could put like a ladder or a kayak on it. That is what you want from an SUV. With this camera though, I think that the form leads function. And what I mean by that is that I think that Fuji has taken a very solid system. The GFX 100 camera itself is a great camera. They've taken that and put it into a body that's designed to look and feel like something like a Leica. It is designed to look like a street camera, but it is not a street camera. And so a lot of the choices in this camera come down to the way that they wanted it to look and to feel, as opposed to building a camera that could support those design choices. What I like about it, and what a lot of Fuji fans will like about it, is that it is analog unless you don't want to use the analog settings, and then it's completely automatic. The aperture feels easy and great to turn because the little nub's on here. It's got a nice click that you can feel on the aperture ring. I like that a lot. I like everything about the dials on this. The viewfinder is really nice. The LCD screen is really nice, although this is the only way that it flips. You can flip it up this way and you can flip it that way. There's no tilting or pivoting on it. Not a big deal for me. So it's got a built-in neutral density filter, which I think is fantastic. If you're going to shoot a camera like this in bright sunlight and you're going to be wide open, you need a neutral density filter in order to compensate for the amount of light so you don't overexpose. Having that in the camera means you never have to bring one with you. That's great. Okay, so we got the good. The good is a beautiful design. The good is manual controls. The good is programmability, so you can customize this camera the way that you want. So if you love Fuji's films, you can simulate any of those, from their color film to their black and white film to their chrome film. So you've got the simulations to do everything. So if you're shooting those simulations though, you have to shoot in JPEG. You can do RAW plus JPEG, but the film simulations apply to the JPEG image, which means you take a 102 megapixel camera and then you're shooting essentially a very large compressed file. But people love film simulations, and if you love those, this is great. There's also a dial in here really weird for me, which is the one to choose the different aspect ratio. I get the idea, but this is one of the very first things that for me would be done by cropping. With 102 megapixels, you have a fixed focal length lens on here. You have a digital zoom, and let's say that you're using the digital zoom to crop in a lot. Now again, you're at the size that a full frame sensor would be. So this medium format sensor is just close to 1.7 times more surface area than a full frame sensor, which means there's much bigger pixels in order to gather light. But the 102 megapixel part of that kind of messes up that equation. The amount of dynamic range in a sensor comes from what's called the pixel pitch, which is the size of the pixels. The bigger the pixel pitch, the more light they can gather, and the better the image quality is when it comes to dynamic range. But there's a trade-off here. Because this medium format sensor packs 102 megapixels into its size, you could get the same amount of dynamic range using a full frame sensor with something like a 60 megapixel sensor. So 102 megapixels should get you more resolution than say a 60 or 50 megapixel, but it doesn't, and that's for a couple reasons in the bad section. The very first biggest problem is that there is no IBIS in this camera, none. So this is a $5,000 camera with no in-body image stabilization at all. And one of the reasons that it doesn't have IBIS is because it has a leaf shutter. A leaf shutter goes inside the lens instead of inside the body, and it is almost impossible to make a camera with IBIS that has a leaf shutter. The trade-off on the leaf shutter is that you get really fast flash sync speeds, like up to 1/4000th of a second. But unless you're doing studio work, a 1/4000th of a second shutter speed sync for a flash does not benefit you at all. So one of the trade-offs here is no IBIS. Now it's not only because of the shutter, it's because of the size of the body and the difficulty that there would be in moving a big medium format sensor around in a body this size. Image stabilization requires motors, it requires the sensor to be able to move around. That does not happen in a body this size. So this is a fixed focal length lens, the equivalent of which on full frame would be a 28 millimeter. And just to start with, 28 millimeters is a really strange focal length for me. It's not wide enough to do really good landscape, and it's not long enough to do really good portrait work. So if I were to design this, I'd probably do a 24 millimeter equivalent in full frame, not a 28. And that doesn't sound like a lot, but it is really a lot at the wide angle photography. Or I'd put an actual 35 millimeter on here to make this better when doing portraits. But okay, let's just go with the fact that 28 millimeter millimeters might be a really good choice for doing street photography. You don't want to have something like a 35 millimeter because then you got to really back up away from your subject to be able to capture a good image of it. Because of medium format, that f4 aperture has the equivalent in the way it looks as an f2.8 lens. So you're not getting the equivalent background defocus of an f4 on this camera as you would on a full frame camera, which is really good for good depth of field dropping off. But the problem is that the amount of light loss from f4 doesn't change whether it's a full frame sensor or a medium format sensor. So the trade-off here is you have a lens that gives you the equivalent in background defocus of an f2.8 lens, but the light gathering capabilities of an f4. So that means you're going to go out with this camera, it's got an f4 lens, and in order to shoot with it, you're going to need to do a slower shutter speed than if this was an f2.8 camera. And there's no IBIS, which means that instead of being able to compensate for that f4 lens with the ability to hold it slower and be stabilized, now you have to shoot it slower and it is not stabilized. Now you could bring a tripod with you and you could put this on a tripod, but this is not a camera that wants to be on a tripod. The whole design sensibility of this is just to walk around holding it. In addition to IBIS issues, it is really hard to do autofocus with a sensor this big unless you have a very sophisticated lens, and by trying to keep the lens as small as possible in this camera, there is not the sophisticated motors that can keep up with a good autofocus system. So let me give you an example. I went out this weekend and I shot the Pride Parade that was happening in my town. A couple weeks ago, I went and I shot one of the Indivisible protests in New York City, so very similar scenes. For the Indivisible protest, I had the Sony a7R5 and the 50mm to 150mm lens. Now, granted, that is a camera and lens combination that's this big, right? For the Pride Parade, I had this camera and this lens. So the amount of out-of-focus shots that I have from this camera versus the Sony camera is astronomically different. Now you say, okay, it's a small camera, it's a compact camera, what do you expect from that? And that is true. It's a small and a compact camera, but first thing is, I cannot tell why these are out of focus. I can't tell if they're out of focus because there's no image stabilization. I can't tell if they're out of focus because the autofocus system wasn't so great. I cannot tell why they're out of focus. I can just tell that they're out of focus. Now, I don't want you to think that I'm saying that this camera is never in focus. There are plenty of really great in-focus shots. In fact, in a shot like this, where we have an obstruction in front of the eye, it still did the eye really well. That's great. Okay, so here's the last thing that drives me a little bit nuts about this camera. It is 102 megapixels, but when I look at the images, I absolutely cannot tell from a resolution and image quality standpoint that they were taken with a 102 megapixel sensor. So you have this camera, it's 102 megapixels. You have this camera, that's the Sony a6700, and if you look at it, it is much shorter than this one and almost exactly the same width. You take this camera, you put something like a pancake lens on it, and now you've got a walk-around system with some of the best autofocus in the industry in a camera that is smaller and much lighter than this camera. And you also have the ability to change lenses when you want to change lenses, right? All right, but I hear you saying, but that's not fair because one of these is an APS-C size camera and the other is a medium format camera, right? They're different images, and that's true. But if you're a Fuji fan, Fuji's been saying how fantastic APS-C is for a decade now, and so you have to at least agree that an APS-C size camera is a fantastic camera when it comes to sensor size. So if you don't buy into that, this is the Sony a7C, and this is not the most recent one, this is my personal a7C. But it's the same size as Sony's a7CR, and that is a 60 megapixel full frame camera that has fantastic state-of-the-art autofocus detection in it. There are hundreds and hundreds of lenses between Sony's and third-party manufacturers that you can put on here, and you can have some of the best autofocus anywhere. So I'm looking online right now, and this camera today is $4,999, so $5,000. So for $2,000 less, you can get a camera that has a very similar pixel pitch to this camera, which means that you can get some lenses from third-party manufacturers to put on here as well, so you have a more versatile camera with full autofocus. Does this camera feel like this camera? Absolutely it does not. The A7C camera bodies feel much more like a toy to me than this camera does. There are very limited controls on the top. There are none of the controls for the shutter speed and the ISO in terms of dials here. If you like that, this camera is the better camera. But for me, is it worth $2,000 to get some dials? Nope, probably not. So the question, I guess, is do you want a 102 megapixel camera where your images are often out of focus? Those out of focus images could be because of the autofocus system, they could be because of the shutter speed, but they definitely are out of focus in part because of the lack of IBIS. So now I think you know where I'm going from a design standpoint, from a control standpoint. I absolutely adore this camera. When it comes to the specs, I don't particularly care about film simulations and the different aspect ratios and the digital zoom. I still think it's a great camera because it has those things. It is always better to give the photographer or videographer the choice of whether they want to do it in camera or on their computer, And I completely am on board with that. But when it comes to image quality, I just don't know what to do. I want to love this camera. But at the end of the day, if the images aren't in focus, for whatever reason it is, I can't see spending $5,000 to get this camera. All right, I've said my piece, so let's wrap it up. I love so much about the idea of the Fujifilm GFX 100 RF. When it comes to real-world use, it was a disappointing camera. Your mileage may vary, of course. These are my impressions. So let me know in the comments below if you think I got some of this wrong. Let me know your thoughts. Does a 102 megapixel medium format camera sound appealing to you? Would you buy this? Is the price right? I'd really like to know your thoughts on where you see this camera fitting into the whole pantheon of cameras these days. For Imaging Resource, I'm the editor, David Schloss. Go out there and give it your best shot.